Ever wondered how enslaved people managed to survive back in the day? From braiding maps into their hair, to poisoning their enslavers' meals with deadly herbs, to digging escape tunnels with bare hands. These are 10 slave survival tricks that still leave historians shaking their heads. 1. Braiding escape maps and resources into hair. Imagine transforming your hair into a sophisticated communication system, a storage device, and even a map to freedom. This is exactly what enslaved women did, turning the ancient African art of hair braiding into one of the most ingenious survival tactics in history. In West and Central African societies, hair braiding was never just about aesthetics. It was a language unto itself, a way of communicating social status, tribal affiliation, and spiritual beliefs. When Africans were violently torn from their homelands, they adapted this cultural practice into something revolutionary, a tool of resistance and survival. Enslaved women would braid intricate cornrow patterns into each other's hair, patterns that appeared to be nothing more than decorative styling to their enslavers. But hidden within those curves, zigzags, and particular arrangements were actual maps encoding escape routes through treacherous terrain, marking safe passages through dense jungles and swamps, and pointing toward freedom. The most compelling evidence comes from San Basilio de Palenque in Colombia, the first free town in the Americas, founded in the early 1600s by escaped enslaved Africans led by Bencos Bioho, an Angolan warrior. In these maroon communities, women became keepers of geographic knowledge, braiding complex designs that served as living, breathing maps passed from one person to another. A curved pattern might represent a winding river offering safe passage northward. Zigzag lines could indicate treacherous but navigable mountain passes. Straight, parallel lines might warn of roads patrolled by soldiers, routes to be avoided at all costs. These patterns were memorized, refined, and taught in secret, creating an oral and visual tradition that allowed groups to flee without ever committing anything to paper. The ingenuity extended beyond navigation. During the horrific Middle Passage, women braided rice seeds, okra seeds, and cotton seeds into their hair. These precious seeds represented agricultural knowledge, cultural continuity, and hope for food sovereignty in the Americas. In Gullah Geechee communities of East, South Carolina, and Georgia, women would braid cowrie shells, powerful African symbols of protection, alongside seeds, creating braids that marked routes northward toward free states. What shocks historians is the multi-layered brilliance. It subverted gender roles, preserved African knowledge systems against cultural erasure, and turned what enslavers viewed as a liability into strength. These braided maps prefigured modern cryptography, challenging the myth of enslaved passivity. Today, Palenque celebrates this heritage through braiding festivals, keeping alive the memory of ancestors who refused to be broken. But hair wasn't the only thing enslaved people used to communicate. They also turned music itself into a weapon of liberation. 2. Coded songs and spirituals for navigation and motivation. If you've ever heard a spiritual like Wade in the Water or Swing Low Sweet Chariot, you're only hearing half the story. These songs were sonic maps, encrypted messages, and lifelines of hope for those seeking freedom, representing one of the most sophisticated survival tactics employed by enslaved people. The genius was their dual nature. On the surface, they were Christian spirituals blending biblical narratives with African call and response traditions. To enslavers who encouraged Christian conversion, these songs seemed like evidence of successful religious indoctrination. But to those who knew how to listen, these same songs were subversive anthems encoding specific instructions, warnings, and encouragement for escape. This oral strategy was born of necessity. Literacy was banned for enslaved people across most of the American South, with teaching someone to read or write being a criminal offense. Enslavers understood that literacy was power, so they denied it systematically. But they couldn't ban singing. Music was too useful for maintaining work rhythms, too embedded in religious practices they promoted. In history's great irony, the very songs enslavers encouraged became vehicles for planning escapes. Harriet Tubman, who led 13 missions freeing more than 70 people from bondage, called music her password, using spirituals to confirm safe houses, signal when to move, and rally groups when despair threatened. Follow the Drinking Gourd is perhaps the most famous coded spiritual, essentially an audio instruction manual for escape. The Drinking Gourd refers to the Big Dipper constellation, which points to the North Star. Lyrics like, "When the sun comes back and the first quail calls, follow the Drinking Gourd," instructed escapees to flee in spring during quail migration season. season, following the constellation northward. The song even mapped a specific route, the Tombigbee River in Mississippi north to the Tennessee River, then to the Ohio River and Freedom. Wade in the Water warned fugitives to cross rivers or walk in streams to erase their scent from bloodhounds tracking them. Tubman reportedly sang it mid-escape to calm children and direct paths through waterways. Go Down Moses identified enslavers as Pharaoh and conductors like Tubman as liberators, with Egypt symbolizing the South. Steal Away to Jesus meant imminent flight, often at night. Swing Low, Sweet Chariot signaled approaching rescuer, with chariot representing wagons or conductors, and Band of Angels, meaning abolitionists. What shocks historians is the psychological and logistical brilliance. These songs sustained hope amid brutal recapture rate, turning surveillance against itself since enslavers encouraged Christian singing. They reveal enslaved intellect as a weapon that influenced abolitionist literature and modern civil rights movements. While songs carried messages of freedom and sound, other enslaved people stitched their hopes into fabric. 3. Quilts and symbols as secret maps. The notion of quilts serving as encoded maps for the Underground Railroad represents one of the most enduring and debated symbols of enslaved resistance. Enslaved seamstresses and quilters, often women tasked with domestic labor, allegedly wove patterns into quilts that conveyed navigational instructions, warnings, or signals to fugitives. These quilts were displayed on porches, fences, or clothesline, ostensibly as ordinary laundry, to guide escapes without arousing suspicion. Common motifs included the wagon wheel, signaling preparation to travel, bears meaning to follow animal trails to safety, flying geese, instructing to head north by following bird migration, and drunkard's path, indicating zigzagging routes to evade pursuers. Enslaved Africans brought knowledge of symbolic cloth making from West African cultures, where kente and adinkra cloths used geometric patterns for proverbs, directions, and spiritual guidance. In the Americas, this evolved amid literacy prohibitions, with quilts becoming a visual language for the illiterate. The Underground Railroad, active during the 1830s through 1860s, relied on such nonverbal cues as spoken codes risked betrayal. Quilting bees doubled as planning sessions, where women shared patterns orally. The modern quilt code theory gained traction from South Carolina quilter Ozella Williams, whose family lore described a sequence of 10 to 13 blocks hung sequentially, starting with crazy quilt to gather supplies, progressing to bow ties for safe house signals, and ending with stars representing freedom. In Kentucky and Ohio border regions, quilts allegedly marked safe house stations. One account describes quilts with monkey wrench patterns signaling tool gathering for escape during the 1850s Fugitive Slave Act era. Despite popularity in museums, no primary sources like slave narratives, diaries, or runaway advertisements explicitly mention quilt codes. The WPA interviews from the 1930s discuss symbolic cloth, but not systematic mapping. Archaeologists at sites like the Levi Jordan Plantation in Texas have found quilts with African motifs suggesting cultural continuity, but not espionage. Proponents cite oral histories and pattern analyses linking blocks to African storytelling, while skeptics label it a well-intentioned myth amplified by 1990s media. Recent scholarship posits layered meanings in quilts for motivation rather than literal maps. Historians remain shocked, even amid debate, by its cultural power. If partially true, it reveals enslaved women's intellectual networks subverting domesticity. It challenges erasure of Black creativity, inspiring modern art, and forcing re-evaluation of folklore as resistance. The legend's endurance underscores quilts' role in preserving dignity, whether as actual maps or powerful symbols of hope. While quilts may have carried hidden meanings, enslaved cooks faced a more audible form of surveillance. 4. Whistling while cooking to prove innocence. Known as the whistle walk, this tactic forced enslaved cooks, primarily women, to whistle or sing continuously while preparing and transporting food from detached kitchens to the main house, ensuring they couldn't sneak bites without detection. This degrading surveillance turned culinary expertise into a performance of subservience, but cooks ingeniously adapted by using the noise for covert communication, signaling portions to hide for family, or subtly sabotaging meals through oversalting or accidental burning. Rooted in the economic control of rations, with enslaved people receiving meager cornmeal allowances, this practice highlighted the kitchen as a battleground of power where food was both sustenance and weapon. On southern estates throughout the 1700s and 1800s, kitchens were separate from main houses to reduce fire risks and isolate enslaved labor. Cooks walked the whistle path, 20 to 100 yards, multiple times daily, balancing trays on their heads in African-derived style. Whistling prevented sampling, as pauses might indicate eating. Failure to whistle meant whipping. This intensified after the 1800s as cash crop plantations prioritizing cotton and tobacco focused on owner luxuries while maintaining strict control over enslaved people's access to food. Ex-slave Tempe Herndon Durham from North Carolina recalled in 1937. "We had to whistle all the time we was fetching things to eat so as not to eat none." Similarly, Millie Williams from South Carolina described singing hymns to mask slipping cornbread to children. These walks occurred at dawn and dusk, syncing with field shifts. Cooks used whistles to coordinate with field hands, hiding scraps in aprons. Historian Kelly Fonto-Dietz details in her research how cooks poisoned arsenic-laced sweets or feigned spills, turning the walk into micro-resistance. One Gullah tale from Beaufort, South Carolina, tells of a cook whistling Amazing Grace while smuggling rum to Maroons. Evidence comes from over 2,300 WPA slave narratives, where 15 to 20% of cook testimonies mention whistling, alongside archaeological finds like kitchen middens showing wasted luxury foods indicating sabotage. Culinary historians affirm it through 19th century diaries, though some argue it's exaggerated oral tradition without universal enforcement, being more common in low country than upcountry regions. The shock lies in its psychological cruelty. It dehumanized skilled artisans who invented Southern cuisine, from gumbo to biscuits, into monitored performers, yet they reclaimed agency through adaptation. This fueled foodways as resistance, influencing Black culinary sovereignty today through soul food festivals and celebrations of Black chef history. Historians are stunned by the irony. Whistling, a joyful African expression, twisted into control, but transformed into quiet revolution. Beyond controlling what went into bodies, enslavers also sought to control what came out of them. 5. Herbal knowledge for fertility control and feigned illness. Enslaved women, drawing on Africans, botanical expertise and adapting to New World plants, employed herbal remedies to exert control over their reproduction in the face of systemic sexual violence and forced breeding policies that treated them as breeders to replenish the enslaved labor force. This tactic encompassed contraceptives to prevent conception, abortifacients to terminate pregnancies, and emmenagogues to induce menstruation, often combined with feigned illnesses induced by milder herbs to avoid work or scrutiny. By denying enslavers the property of more children, whose status was inherited matrilineally under slave codes, these acts constituted profound resistance, preserving bodily autonomy amid rape, family separations, and maternal mortality rates up to 50% higher for enslaved women due to overwork. West and Central African women brought knowledge of plants like neem or aloes for fertility regulation, which they transposed to American flora. Cotton root bark, abundant on plantations, became a staple. Boiled into tea, it allegedly contracted the uterus to expel fetuses or prevent implantation. Other remedies included pennyroyal for inducing cramps, rue as an abortifacient, and wild carrot seeds chewed daily as a contraceptive. These were shared in secret conjure networks or midwifery circles, often during all-night vigils away from overseer surveillance. In the antebellum South during the 1820s through 1860s, women on rice and cotton plantations brewed cotton tea from root bark scraped at night, as documented in low-country Gullah traditions. One WPA narrative from ex-slave Margaret Nickerson from South Carolina describes a midwife using it to stop children from coming after assaults, estimating it saved many women from bearing under the lash. Herbs like Jimson weed mimicked delirium for hysteria excuses, allowing evasion of field labor. In extreme cases, post-birth infanticide via smothering or herbal overdose served as maternal resistance. Enslaved midwives dosed patients with blue cohosh to regulate cycles, subverting owners' breeding incentives like bounties for live births. Primary evidence stems from WPA slave narratives, with over 100 mentions of roots and herbs for women's troubles. 19th century medical journals ironically revealing enslaved women's herbal knowledge, and archaeological finds of pollen residues of abortifacients in privies at plantation sites. Recent scholarship analyzes plantation ledgers showing anomalously low birth rates, 20 to 30% below expected in South Carolina, attributing them to herbal sabotage. Studies on Hollywood plantation artifacts uncovered cotton root fragments in women's quarters, confirming use. Historians are shocked by the scale and subtlety. It challenged slavery's economic calculus, with estimates suggesting 10 to 25% of pregnancies terminated herbally. This reframes enslaved women not as victims, but as biopolitical agents, influencing modern reproductive justice discourses. The tactic's risk, herbal overdoses cause deaths, highlights desperation, yet its persistence across the diaspora stunned scholars who note it as quiet warfare against gendered oppression. While women fought invisible battles over their bodies, others waged more visible campaigns of everyday resistance. 6. Sabotage of tools and work slowdowns. Enslaved laborers engaged in day-to-day resistance by deliberately damaging equipment, feigning incompetence, or pacing work to minimal speeds, eroding plantation profitability without provoking overt rebellion. Tools like hoes, plows, and axes were broken or dulled on purpose, often by accidentally dropping them on rocks or hiding them, while slowdowns involved collective tacit agreements to stretch tasks, such as weeding a row in hours instead of minutes. This nonviolent sabotage exploited overseers' reliance on coerced output, costing the antebellum economy millions in today's equivalent of $1 to $2 billion in lost cotton yields, forcing owners to hire more supervisors and, ironically, straining their resources. Plantations operated on task systems where workers completed assigned rows, then earned free time, or gang labor requiring constant pace, but enslaved people gamed both. In gang method, one worker's slow drag pulled down the entire line's productivity. Tools were cheap but essential. Breaking them created downtime for rest, socializing, or plotting. This peaked during the 1830s through 1850s cotton boom, when output demands intensified after Nat Turner's revolt in 1831, leading to stricter patrols but porous enforcement that enslaved people exploited. George Washington's Mount Vernon estate records from the 1780s and 1790s document over 20 incidents of careless tool damage by enslaved blacksmiths and field hands, including bent plowshares and chipped hoes, with diary entries noting Negroes' laziness. One worker named Jack repeatedly lost axes, using the search time for naps and rest. On South Carolina rice fields, women led organized slowdowns, agreeing through glances to hoe at half speed, as recalled in WPA accounts from ex-slave Jacob Stroyer. "We'd make a row last all day." Gullah communities coordinated via songs, turning quotas into marathons of resistance. Linked tactics included barn burnings like those preceding the 1835 Natchez Uprising, or malingering with self-inflicted minor injuries, such as rubbing dirt in cuts to feign infection. Evidence comes from plantation journals like Thomas Thistlewood's Jamaica Logs from the 1750s, tallying 15% tool losses as sabotage, runaway advertisements decrying idle workers, and WPA testimonies where 30% of narratives cite slowdowns. Archaeological evidence from Monticello includes unnaturally worn tools with consistent fracture patterns. Digital history analyses estimate sabotage reduced yields by 10 to 20% annually. The shock stems from its invisibility and efficacy. Unlike flashy revolts, this weapons of the weak approach proved slavery's inherent inefficiency, with owners like Jefferson complaining of indolence in personal letters. Historians are stunned by gender dynamics. Women's slowdowns in domestic roles mirrored field tactics, revealing collective agency that chipped away at the system, influencing modern labor studies. Recent re-examinations affirmed tool breaking's prevalence, debunking docile slave myths and showing how everyday resistance eroded the institution from within. From subtle sabotage, we now turn to one of the boldest escape attempts imaginable. 7. Mailing oneself to freedom, the box escape. The audacious box escape tactic epitomized the desperate ingenuity of enslaved individuals who turned the very infrastructure of commerce, shipping crates, and postal systems against the institution of slavery itself. Pioneered most famously by Henry Box Brown in 1849, this method involved sealing oneself in a small, unassuming wooden box and mailing it via express freight from a slave state to a free one, enduring extreme physical and psychological torment in transit. Crates were typically 3 feet long by 2 feet wide and 2.5 feet high, lined with cloth for minimal comfort, provisioned with a few biscuits, a bladder of water, and a hole for ventilation. This high-stakes gambit exploited the anonymity of cargo transport, where boxes were rarely inspected amid booming 19th-century trade. But it demanded precise planning, trusted accomplices, and ironclad nerve, as discovery meant certain recapture or death. By the 1840s, U.S. railroads and steamships facilitated rapid interstate shipping, with Adams Express Company handling abolitionist couriers unknowingly. Enslaved people in urban areas like Richmond, Virginia, Brown's home, had proximity to ports and warehouses, but the looming 1850 Fugitive Slave Act intensified patrols and danger. Brown, a tobacco factory worker separated from his wife and children after their sale, vowed escape after witnessing their auction. Collaborating with white Quaker Samuel Smith and free black barber James Caesar Jones, Brown fasted for days to fit the box, then endured 27 hours of jolting upside-down travel from Richmond to Philadelphia's abolitionist haven. On March 30th, 1849, Brown, then 33 years old, was nailed into the pine box labeled dry goods and shipped for 86 cents. Inside, he prayed silently as the box was tossed like luggage, once inverted for hours, causing blood to rush to his head. Emerging at the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee headquarters, he sang a hymn of thanks, dubbing himself Box Brown. He later self-published his narrative in 1849, illustrated with a crate diagram, and toured as an abolitionist, mesmerizing crowds with sleight-of-hand illusions, including mailing himself on stage in dramatic reenactments. Brown's feat inspired copycats, like an 1851 attempt by two enslaved Virginians using a similar crate, but foiled by rough handling. Earlier echoes appear in 1830s Jamaica maroon tactics of hiding in rum barrels. Post-Brown, the method influenced fictionalized escapes in Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852, amplifying its legend across the abolitionist movement. Brown's own narrative, corroborated by Smith's affidavits and Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society minutes archived at the Library of Congress, provides irrefutable primary evidence, including the original box, now at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Newspaper clippings from 1849 confirm the event's immediacy and public impact. Historians are shocked by the visceral risks. Brown hallucinated from dehydration and claustrophobia, with 50% fatality odds from suffocation or injury, yet its success exposed slavery's porous borders. It stunned contemporaries like Frederick Douglass, who wrote the narrative's preface, praising Brown's Yankee ingenuity as a critique of American commerce complicity. Scholars today hail it as proto-performance art, subverting objectification of enslaved people as cargo into agency, influencing escape lore and modern migration analogies. From boxing themselves to freedom, others used costumes and cunning to walk out in plain sight. 8. Disguise and role reversal. Disguise tactics weaponized the racial, gender, and class assumptions embedded in slavery, allowing fugitives to impersonate authority figures or invert hierarchies to slip through checkpoints, trains, and steamboats undetected. Enslaved individuals altered appearances with stolen clothes, makeup, bandages, or props, often traveling in pairs to exploit passing privileges. Light-skinned individuals posing as whites, or couples reversing master-slave dynamics in elaborate performances. This required intimate knowledge of white mannerisms gleaned from eavesdropping and bold improvisation, turning vulnerability into camouflage amid a society where black bodies were hyper-visible and relentlessly policed by patrols and suspicious citizens. The 1830s through 1850s saw expanded rail lines like the Baltimore and Ohio, but Jim Crow precursors barred free blacks from first-class cars, forcing reliance on conductor bribes or disguises. Light-skinned enslaved people, often of mixed heritage from rape, had paper advantages for passing as white. Role reversals mocked the peculiar institution by having the supposed master, actually enslaved in disguise, command the supposed slave, highlighting the system's absurdity and arbitrary nature. In December 1848, Georgia carpenter William Craft, dark-skinned, and his lighter-skinned wife Ellen, who could pass as white due to her father's heritage, executed a masterful role swap. Ellen dressed in tailored gentleman's attire, top hat, greatcoat, spectacles, and green glasses to hide illiteracy, posing as a sickly southern planter traveling north for medical treatment. Bandages swathed her chin and arm, feigned jaw pain and broken wrist, preventing writing signatures or speaking, as her Georgia drawl risked exposure. William followed as her faithful valet, carrying luggage and fending off suspicions with prepared stories. They boarded trains from Macon to Savannah, then a steamer to Charleston, and finally to Philadelphia, 1,000 miles in 4 days, bribing minimally and charming skeptics with their convincing performance. Settling in Boston, they published Running 1,000 Miles Eve for Freedom in 1860, illustrated with Ellen's gentleman sketch showing her in full disguise. Other variants included Henry Banks in 1844, disguising as a French sailor using pidgin English and a stolen uniform to sail to Canada. Women like Harriet Jacobs hid in attic garrets for years, emerging disguised as nurses. Group efforts included the 1851 Pearl Escape, where 77 fugitives used fake passes and wigs to board vessels. The Crafts narrative, endorsed by abolitionists like Wendell Phillips and serialized in The Liberator, is bolstered by travel receipts and eyewitness letters from Boston's black community. Boston Public Library archives hold their portraits, confirming Ellen's ambiguous features, allowing her to pass convincingly as white. The shock factor lies in psychological inversion. By embodying the oppressor, the Crafts exposed slavery's fragility, dependent on unexamined privileges. As Ellen later quipped, "I was my own master." Historians marveled at the dramatic genius, estimating disguises aided 20% of escapes. Modern scholars analyze it as early genderqueer resistance, challenging binaries, and inspiring transatlantic abolition, as the Crafts lectured in Britain. Its audacity, Ellen enduring catcalls as a man, reveals enslaved intellect's edge over brute force, reframing history from victimhood to virtuoso subversion. While some escaped by pretending to be someone else, others took control of the very vessels meant to confine them. 9. Commandeering ships or vehicles. Commandeering vessels or transport, stealing boats, ships, or even trains, represented the pinnacle of high-risk collective resistance, leveraging enslaved individuals' forced expertise in navigation, piloting, or mechanics against their captors. Enslaved sailors, stevedores, and drivers trained in maritime trades or animal husbandry used stolen keys, insider knowledge of routes, and nighttime opportunism to hijack crafts and ferry groups to freedom. This tactic thrived in coastal or riverine regions where waterways offered swift escapes from patrols, but it demanded split-second timing and group trust, often under cannon fire or pursuit. Successes not only liberated dozens, but also delivered valuable intelligence or assets to Union forces during the Civil War, turning fugitives into strategic assets. From the 1700s onward, 10 to 20% of enslaved men in ports like Charleston or New Orleans worked ships, gaining skills in sails, tides, and signals, skills owners exploited but couldn't fully control. Rivers like the Mississippi or sounds like the Dismal Swamp provided natural highways north. By the 1850s, steamers and ferries multiplied options, but the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act spurred bolder acts, with abolitionists smuggling charts to aid these maritime escapes. On May 13, 1862, amid the Civil War, 23-year-old South Carolina pilot Robert Smalls, enslaved on the Confederate gunboat CSS Planter, masterminded its seizure. Smalls had memorized codes, steam gauges, and minefield patterns from daily patrols, waiting for the white crew's Sunday ashore leave. With 8 enslaved crew and their families totaling 16 people, he donned the captain's straw hat and uniform, hoisted a bedsheet as a truce flag, and steamed past 5 forts toward Union lines at Hilton Head. Mimicking the captain's whistle, he evaded scrutiny, even saluting sentries with perfect imitation. Delivering the 150-ton ship armed with 21 guns and a codebook to the U.S. Navy, Smalls earned $1,500 prize money and freedom. He later commanded the Planter for the Union, piloted Charleston Harbor post-emancipation, and served 5 terms in Congress from 1875 to 1887, advocating for black rights and education. Other naval hijackings included Anthony Chase and crew stealing a sloop from Norfolk in 1847, navigating 200 miles to New Jersey using stolen compasses. During the war, group efforts like the 1855 Florida Keys boat theft by 20 Seminole Maroons used improvised oars from palmetto fronds, rowing through treacherous waters to freedom in the Bahamas. Smalls's feat is richly documented in his own 1895 autobiography, Union Navy logs praising the Negro pilot's daring, and Charleston newspapers with ads for his recapture, ironically. The Planter's artifacts, including Smalls's uniform, are preserved at the Beaufort History Museum. WPA narratives from Smalls's descendants and recent naval exhibits confirm details, estimating over 50 similar commandeering during the war alone. Historians are shocked by the tactical brilliance. Smalls's bluff, exploiting white overconfidence in black subservience, exposed Confederate vulnerabilities, hastening port falls, and inspiring over 5,000 enslaved enlistments in Union forces. Scholars hail it as nautical abolitionism, reframing enslaved labor as subversive capital, and influencing modern naval equity discussions. From commanding ships on water, our next story takes us underground to the most literal form of escape. 10. Digging tunnels or using improvised tools for escape. Enslaved captives resorted to laborious subterranean escapes, digging tunnels with spoons, nails, or bare hands when surface flight was impossible, often in forts, prisons, or crowded barracks where walls and guards made other routes unviable. This tactic echoed African mining resistances and prison breaks, using scavenged tools to burrow under walls or fences over weeks or months, propping tunnels with sticks or cloth to prevent cave-ins that could bury diggers alive. Improvised aids like forged passes, carved from chicken bones, or rafts constructed from oilcloth raincoats complemented digs, turning refuse and discarded materials into routes to freedom. Risks were immense: cave-ins, detection by patrol dogs, or flooding from underground water. But successes freed hundreds, particularly in Middle Passage castles or Civil War contraband camps. Slave castles like Elmina in Ghana or Goree Island in Senegal held thousands awaiting shipment, with doors of no return as final barriers before the Atlantic crossing. In the Americas, urban jails or workhouses like those in Charleston during the 1800s confined runaways, where digging targeted soft sand or crumbling brick. Civil War Union contraband camps holding freed enslaved people saw ironic escapes from mismanagement and poor conditions. Tools were minimalist: spoon handles filed into chisels against stone floors, barrel staves used as levers, even fingernails when nothing else was available. At Ghana's Elmina Castle in the late 1700s, captives under Dutch control dug a 50-foot tunnel from dungeons using smuggled nails and coconut husks, emerging in a courtyard to flee into surrounding forests. Oral Ashanti histories describe women initiating the dig during women's quarter shifts, freeing 30 people before detection. Similar efforts at Cape Coast Castle saw a 1780s group using fingernails and oyster shells for a 20-foot burrow under impossible conditions. In the United States, Nat Turner's co-conspirators dug under Southampton County jail walls with table knives in 1831, attempting escape after the rebellion's failure. The 1856 Great Escape from Kentucky's Fayette County saw fugitives carve fake passes from bone and dig with plowshares, then build a corncob raft to cross the Ohio River. Harriet Tubman's 1850s Maryland operations used awls to create hidey holes in safe houses, providing temporary refuge for those fleeing north along her routes. African examples draw from UNESCO oral archives and European logs noting burrowings in company records. U.S. evidence includes jail blueprints with escape marks in National Archives collections and WPA tales describing spoon digs in vivid detail. Archaeological excavations at Goree in 2019 uncovered tunnel remnants with nail fragments, while recent studies date Elmina efforts to the 1690s via pottery shards found in collapsed passages. The shock is primal endurance. Digging in total darkness, rationing air for families including children, these acts defied fort designers' arrogance and so-called impregnable security, with survival rates under 30% due to collapses and suffocation. Historians are stunned by cross-cultural continuity, from Igbo earth shrines to maroon tunnels, proving enslaved engineering rivaled trained professionals. It challenges passive victim tropes, inspiring modern prison abolition movements and site memorials like Elmina's Tunnel of Hope exhibit, underscoring how improvisation and determination eroded empire's very foundations, one spoonful of dirt at a time. Thanks for watching. If you had a good time, keep the adventure alive by clicking on one of the suggested videos on your screen right now for more amazing content.